Hey there booktube, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to tell you about the books that I read in July and the first week of August because Booktubeathon happened over the last few days in July and the first few days in August, and so I thought that I would include those books in this wrap up because most of them I've already talked about. I did vlogs during Booktubeathon as well as the 7 in 7 readathon, which is where I read most of the books that I'm going to talk about today. So this video is not going to be very long because I've already talked about most of the books in depth during the vlogs. So I'll just give you a little recap. So during the period between July and August 5th, I read 12 books, and of those I have ratings from 2 stars to 5 stars. So I'll go chronologically in the order that I read the books because, you know, I have to do book links at the end. The first book that I'll tell you about is A Little History of the United States by James West Davidson. It's always good to read more and to understand more about the country that you live in. And so I really appreciated reading this book and learning some things that I didn't know, hearing some backstory that I never quite grasped before. And so that was interesting. I did a full review on this book and I think I gave it 4 stars because even though I had some major criticisms of the book and of the writing and of the author and publisher's failure to cite any kind of sources, I still felt like I learned a lot and I was thoroughly engaged in the last part of the book, and so I gave this 4 stars. Then I read Trial on Mount Koya by Susan Span, and while this is part of a series, it does read as a standalone book. It takes place in the 16th century in Japan, and we have a priest and his samurai caretaker or guide traveling on this mountain called Mount Koya, and they seek refuge in a Buddhist temple. And while they're there, the priests start being killed overnight, one by one, with their bodies mutilated and arranged to look like the judges of the underworld in this Buddhist belief system. So it's up to the Jesuit priest and his ninja guide slash sidekick to figure out who the killer is while they're sequestered before the killer gets around to offing them. I enjoyed this book for the intersection it presented of Japanese and Christian culture and philosophy, and how it discussed this ancient world with such relevance that it felt like you could be having this kind of religious conversation right now. In the end, I gave it 3 stars because there were points where the writing just didn't flow so well. But 3 stars is pretty high for me because that means that I liked this book. Then I read The Sea by John Banville, which is about an older man who, after his wife dies, he returns to this seaside resort that he and his family spent some time in when he was a child. And he's trying to deal with the reflections that he's having on his wife, but also on this very significant relationship he had with members of a family at the seaside resort as a child. And in his recollections and his reflections, and indeed the interactions that he has with even some of the relics of his past, he reveals himself to be a very damaged character, an insecure little boy who even at his advanced age is still fighting with the idea that people will look at him and not think that he's good enough. And so a big part of the experience of reading this book was just trying to wade through some of the vocabulary that the author presented. And I realized eventually that that was part of the writing technique, where the author was trying to show how the narrator, this Max Morden, had tried to remake himself and was trying to be more than he thought he was. And using the sophisticated language and writing about the art of others was his way of not having people inspect him so closely. I thought that this was a fantastic read. I did the buddy read of this one with Ka, who's one of my subscribers. Hey K, and I gave this 5 stars. Then I read Meatball Sundae by Seth Godin, which is really a marketing book, but with principles that you can apply to other aspects of your life. And in this one, he talks about how you can marry these different ideas and how sometimes things are not compatible, but you can totally remake your story so that you can include the best of both worlds. In this little book, he talks about how sometimes it's almost irresistible to add on these beautiful new accompaniments to an old product, but sometimes you need to revise the storyline itself, because just like you can take a bowl of meatballs and then add cherries and whipped cream on the top to make a meatball sundae, sometimes you have to start with what's at the bottom and reinvent the whole dish from the bottom up. And so in this, he takes an analogy and gives you tips on how to apply this to your business and how to apply it to any kind of entrepreneurial venture that you have. While I did enjoy the principles that Godin expounded on in this book, a lot of it was outdated, and so I ended up giving it 2 stars. This is a book that could definitely benefit from a revamp, having a Meatball Sundae 2.0 redone and created for this new time. While this book was first published in 2007, this paperback edition was published in 2012. So in 6 years, it feels like it's become obsolete. So I think this is a book that could still market and package these principles, but with new case studies that feel like they're a little bit more relevant for today. So 2 stars for this one. Then I read When the Emperor Was Divine by Julie Otsuka, and this one takes place in 1942 California, when Japanese immigrants were being suspected of treason. Some of them were being rounded up, the men were being arrested, and the women and children were being carted off to concentration camps almost, with the fear that because the United States and Japan were on opposite sides of the war, these Japanese residents now living in America couldn't be trusted. And so in this book we read about the experience that one family has when the husband has been taken away, and what the wife and the 2 children endure while he's gone, and they're taken or invited to go to Utah. They leave California and travel all the way to Utah, and they live there for a couple of years before they're allowed to return home when the war is over. And about, you know, the suspicion that they face before the war and even afterwards, when people just still felt like they couldn't be trusted. The novel is written through this omniscient third person, but each chapter follows a different member of the family, and so we get to see how this total upheaval is viewed by each member of the family, and about the sacrifices that each one makes for himself as well as for the other family members. This was just such a heart-wrenching read, to remember that this kind of stuff happened in 1942, and to reflect on that history, and to think that some of it is still happening in 2018. I gave this one 4 stars because it wasn't quite as good as The Buddha in the Attic, which is her other novel that I read last year, but I really enjoyed this nonetheless. And the last book that I read for the 7 in 7 readathon was How to Love a Jamaican by Alexia Arthurs. This is a collection of short stories that follows characters who are either Jamaican immigrants or people who are still living in Jamaica. And while I enjoyed a lot of the fact that the stories were nostalgic for me, some of them reminded me of situations and people that I knew when I was growing up. But I didn't love the themes in this book. I didn't love the way that a lot of the females were written. A lot of them felt like they had given up, even as children or young women, that their self-sacrifice was not necessarily the message that I wanted to read from these characters. We had a lot of girls who felt like they were victims, and they were indeed victimized in their communities. Like, we had a story where a young girl became pregnant from a relationship that she was having with an older married man in the community, and of course she was chastised by her family members and the community members because they felt like she was not being responsible by having a baby with this man. And it seemed like the man hadn't gotten the same kind of chastisement. Like, there was no punishment for him because he had, you know, started a relationship outside of his marriage and gotten a young girl pregnant. But aside from that, just the fact that this young girl acted as though she didn't have a choice, I didn't love those themes. And it felt like it rippled through a lot of the stories, where we had these women who seemed like they were intent on becoming independent and had made strides to make themselves independent. And yet as soon as they discovered a man and started a relationship with him, it was as though none of those previous goals meant anything, and they were willing to give it all up for some guy. And I hated that. So in the end, I gave this 3 stars because it had some good, but I didn't love this. So I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've read this one, especially if you're Jamaican like me. And just as soon as the 7 in 7 readathon was over, it was time for Booktubeathon 2018 to start. And if you watched my daily video challenges, or if you watched my vlog recap that I posted yesterday, then you'll know that I read 6 books. And so the first one was The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which I've been meaning to read for ages, and I finally read it. And it was a total 5-star read. It was about this dystopic, futuristic society that is also linked to the present day. And it's funny because Margaret Atwood, when she was writing this in, when was this book written? 1986. She couldn't have known what the future was going to be like. But no politics on this channel, just literature. So in the story, we have a situation where the white population is in decline. The white birth rates have fallen, they're almost non-existent. And so white women who have proven their fecundity, women who've had a child before, and especially those who've been in relationships that are not considered to be good. Women who are in second marriages or who've been charged with adultery, these white women are rounded up, their children are taken away from them, especially if they're girls, and they're also put into camps so they can be raised to breed future children. But their mothers are taken as kind of sex slaves and are sold off to families so that they can sleep with the men and become surrogates for the family so that they can have children through these handmaids. And of course, it mimics the handmaid story of Rachel giving her maid to Jacob in the Bible and allowing her maid to have a baby for her, being a surrogate. This one was enthralling and haunting and reflective and emotional, and I gave it 5 stars. And I read Rancher's Dream by B.J. Daniels, who is the only Harlequin romance writer that I read from. I've been reading through this Montana Cahill series through the publisher, and she writes about this family of few siblings, and in each one of the books another sibling gets their chance at love, and the stories are all linked. So in this one we read about Hawk, who his high school / college girlfriend, they broke up because she wanted to go travel the world and he wanted her to stay at home and get married and start a family, and she didn't want that, of course, so they broke up. And unfortunately, right before they broke up, she found that she was pregnant and she lost the baby, but he thought that because she was considering having an abortion that she had deceived him, and so he hated her and they went their separate ways. She started a new relationship with this New York businessman who swept her off her feet, and just a few months later they're married. And instead of this new husband taking her to New York, which is what she thinks, a new life to start over far away from the cowboy, husband deposits her back in her hometown on the wedding night, and then he disappears. And of course Hawk comes back to save her from whatever scrape she's found herself in. I didn't like the idea of this love triangle, especially with 2 people that are just married, they're newlyweds, and here on her wedding night, okay, her husband has disappeared, but does that mean that her vows are no longer valid? I enjoyed certain things about this book, but this is definitely not my favorite of the series. In this one, I felt like the author wrote herself into a corner almost, because if you're a true romantic, true romance lover, you can't champion for a love triangle, no matter how attractive the cowboy, no matter how destined you think the guy and the girl are for each other. The woman has just taken vows with someone else. How can you root for her to leave her husband if that's the case? How can you root for this man that she's just promised her life to, for something bad to happen to him? So it felt like an impossible situation. And because Hawk is the cowboy, he's the hero of the story, you know that they have to end up together in the end, but the resolution is not good. And so I gave this 3 stars. But if it was an individual book, I would have rated it much lower. I gave it 3 stars because I'm invested in the characters, I'm invested in the storyline, but not necessarily this particular installment. Then I read The Little Paris Bookshop by Nina George, which was another disappointment. The story in this one is about this 50-year-old man who, when he was in his mid-20s, he started a relationship with a woman who was also in another relationship with someone else, and kind of having this open, free love kind of experience. And so they had what amounted to, I think, 5-year romance, and then she suddenly left him and wrote him a letter when she was leaving. And because he thought that the letter was her breakup to him, he didn't read it, and he left it in a room, in a table, for 20 years. And 20 years later, a woman moves into his apartment building, and he's forced to read the letter and find out what happened to his former lover. And it's just all kinds of sad in terms of his life and how he's allowed 20 years of his life to just go by without making any moves towards reconciling his feelings. So that part of the book was a sappy romantic read. What elevated this book for me was the literary references. The man, what's his name? Monsieur Perdue, which of course in French, Perdue means lost. So his name is John Lost. He is a literary apothecary, which means he has a bookshop and he prescribes books to people to help them out of whatever situation they're facing. And I love that part. I love the fact that he found refuge in books and that he was able to recommend books that other people could also find refuge in. I love that idea. I love the literary references. I love the books that were talked about. I love the the descriptions of what books can do for you, about the meaning of literature in life. But man, I hated the relationships that the author created in here. The other man in the love triangle, his name is Luke. So we have Jean and Luke, which together is the ideal man that you expect when you hear about these French romances. Jean-Luc, right? So this woman, in looking for her perfect man, finds two men that are, one is Jean, one is Luke. And so together she would have been in this complete love, but separately, neither one of them could fulfill her completely. And I hated that as a story. I hated the fact that there was adultery in this book as well. I hated the open, free love relationships. I hated the way the author tried to put all those things back together in the end and to make everything meaningful. But aside from that, the literary references were just so good that I was willing to overlook some of the failings. And so eventually I gave this 3 stars, because while it did take me to some high highs and some low lows, I settled someplace in the middle, and so this is a 3-star book. Then I read The Nerdiest, Wimpiest, Dorkiest, I Funny Ever by James Patterson and Chris Rabinstein. This is a middle grade series book, and I bought this for one of my students, and I wanted to read it before I gave it to him because I don't like to give books, especially to kids, without knowing exactly what the content is. So I read it first, and of course this is a part of a series. And the main character is a stand-up comedian, except he can't stand up. He's wheelchair bound because of an accident that he suffered when he was a child. He's also an orphan because his parents also died in that accident, and I think also he lost a sister. So he's endured some very traumatic experiences, and yet he has this really positive outlook on life. And in previous installments in the book, I suppose, he's won these competitions, and so now he has his own sitcom, which is funny because he's a sitcom as opposed to a stand-up comedian. And he now has this opportunity to compete again, but worldwide. And as he travels, he meets these people who are intent on getting him to change his philosophy about loving everybody and love changing all, and try to get him to use comedy to make fun of people instead of to make people feel good. And I love that he stayed true to himself and wouldn't allow anyone to change who he was, to change his objective, to change his heart. And so at the end, I was completely in love with this character. I mean, it's not the kind of book that I'm gonna put down all my Man Booker Prize winning books and read, but I enjoyed the message in this book. It's a little over 300 pages, which means that my student is not gonna be so excited about reading such a big book, but it goes very fast. It has quite a few illustrations, and the drawings don't use the same jokes that are in the text. It introduces new material, and I love that. I thought that the book was really well researched, that the jokes were pretty good. They were on point. Some of them were corny, but they were supposed to be corny. Like there was a character in there who was from Iowa, and so she gave corny jokes because she's from a corny state. I love that. I love the puns. I love the way the book was written for kids, but you could still read it as an adult if you like middle grade books and still enjoy it. So I gave this one, I think, 4 stars. Nah, I gave it 3 stars, but I might revise that later. Then I read this book that I won from a giveaway on Jen Campbell's channel, and this is Things Bright and Beautiful by Anbara Salam. And I had really high hopes for this book. I started off reading this book with a hat and thinking that this was going to make me feel all churchy. It didn't. And this one's about a young woman named Beatrice and her husband named Max, who's a pastor and a missionary, and so she accompanies him on this mission trip to the Pacific Islands, expecting, I'm not sure what, an island paradise. But both Max and Beatrice are in for the shock of their lives. The previous missionary is still there, and she's still kind of holding on to the turf. The man who's responsible for keeping up the church that was established in some previous mission trip, he seems like he's practicing some dark magic, and he seems intent on ridding the demons that are in Max and Beatrice. And eventually, one or both of them succumb to this dark power. And up to the end of the book, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be reading. Was this a religious conversion or a conversion from religion to magic? The major thing that this book accomplished was to dispel whatever expectations you have of this island paradise. And it just shows all the people in crisis, people who had come from very different places, the man and his wife as missionaries, the former missionary, people who had come to the country because of the war, Oh, I forgot to tell you, the book is set right after World War, so in the early 1950s. Max is from the United States, his wife is from Venezuela. We have these colonialists who have established plantations on the island, as well as we have these migrant workers who've come from Vietnam to work the fields. And the different interaction that each person has with the other characters, but also with the land. How the land is just very unforgiving, and it feels like it takes more than it gives. And so at the end, I didn't love this. I couldn't understand what the message was that the author was trying to portray. Was it that religion is the opium of the masses and the people who have been converted just need to wake up from their opioid state? I didn't know, and I didn't like it. I just didn't like it. So I gave it 2 stars in the end because it had a really troubling ending that, man, yeah. We'll talk about that another time. I'm sorry, I really wanted to love that book, but I didn't. And then we moved on to Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi, which is another book that, spoiler alert, I didn't like. At the end, I gave it 3 stars because there were points in here where the writing was good, but I did not like the story. I met the author. I went a few months ago to an author talk and heard her speak about this book. And I didn't buy it then because I just wasn't sure this was a book that I really wanted to own. The story in this novel is about a girl named Ada. She's born in Nigeria to Nigerian parents. At least her father is from Nigeria. Her mother is from some other place. And she has an older brother and a younger sister, but they're born someplace else. And she talks about how it was necessary for her to have been born in Nigeria for her to be what she is. And the word that she uses for that is an obanji, which is a spirit living in a human form until it's time to return to the spirit world. And all the names in this book have meanings. So her name is Ada, which, you know, sounds like the word adder, which is a snake. And that is because her mother, her true mother, not her human birth mother, her true mother is a python. And she was born because the father had prayed. And the answer to a prayer is also the same Nigerian word that means python's egg. And so she is that answered prayer. Throughout the book, there are a whole lot of spiritual references, mentions of the Christian God and Jesus, Yeshua, as well as even more references to Nigerian, Yoruba, and Igbo mythology and gods and goddesses. And eventually, when the now adult Ada reveals and names these various parts of herself, some female, some male, the book starts to feel like you're reading the account of a schizophrenic's thoughts and her explanations for some of the things that she does, her scarification, her cutting, her tattooing, and eventually her mutilation of her body for one or many reasons, the way she treats other people. This is just not a book that I could get behind. And so I read it because I said I was going to read it, and now I've read it, I just want to put it down. And so even though I didn't completely finish it during Booktubeathon, it's a book that I just wanted to finish, wrap it up, send it back to the library because I don't want to read this book ever again. There were parts of the book that were written really well, and I could see the author's literary ability. But this is not a book that I liked. So I gave this a 3 star. I think I might even bring it back down to a 2 because this is not a book that I loved. This is not even a book that I liked. That's it. These are the 12 books that I read in July and the first part of August. I said I was going to do book links, but I'm not going to because I also said that this video is going to be pretty short, and then it's not. And I don't want to make this video any longer than it is. But I think you can see the links that were established from one book to another if there were some. Some of these books didn't really have a natural connection to the other one. But thanks for watching this video. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know if I talked about a book here today that you'd like to talk a little bit more about. Some of these are new books that you might have on your TBR. Some of them might even be older books, backlisted books that you still haven't read either, and you wanted to talk a little bit more about them. Go ahead and chat with me in the comments. So we'll talk down there. And until next time, happy reading. Bye.